I don't really have a plan for this. I just saw the Batman, and James was like, "Hey, you should record your thoughts." So I jotted like a bunch of stuff down. So yesterday I saw the Batman with my co-host, well, my old co-host from the After Artist, B, and B kind of explained that this other friend of ours really didn't like the film. And when we kind of walked out of the theater, we were both genuinely stunned at how good we thought the film was. And I kind of get why some people might not like it, especially if you come off the back of the Nolan stuff. It is really, really different. But there are a bunch of little details that I really liked that jumped out and I thought were worthy of discussion. I'm not going to do like Easter eggs or references, but instead I just want to talk about like why I enjoyed this film and I think what it's trying to achieve. I think in film crit, it's often difficult to kind of separate taste, quality, and craft. They seem to go hand in hand. So instead, here's a list of things that made the film feel the way it does.
Sorry.
I wouldn't be bothering you here, but your people keep telling me you're unavailable. You know, you really could be doing more for this city.
The first and kind of most obvious thing is the way that the film is shot is really different. A lot of the framing and focal distances leave characters slightly out of frame, off center, or partially racked in focus. Whether it's the first murder that kicks off the whole thing or the crime scene analysis after, the camera is constantly focused on details without much care for framing or being technically correct. Instead, the lens concerns itself with representing the emotional locus of the moment. If a scene is tense or highly strung, it's going to pick something in the scene and pay attention to it that represents that emotion. A lot of lenses with really short focal distances and heavy racking blend characters and scenery together. Combined with the neon backgrounds and the yellows and blues, it's often quite hard to actually differentiate a character from the scenery unless you really pay attention. Another technique that you see throughout the film is focusing on objects next to characters, leaving them partially obscured or partially out of focus or distorted, allowing us to concentrate on the thrust of the moment or the emotion or the feeling that that character might have, rather than kind of giving us the exact detail or specific, context of that moment. It's less important physically where a character is standing in a space, and more important what they're concerned about and what they're thinking and feeling. The rich emotionality means that this film is ultimately filled with subtext, because you can't always physically see someone's facial expression. You have to try and understand it from cadence of speech, body language, movement in the space. Not only that, but dissolving this barrier between characters and Gotham gives the city life and memory and movement and essence. The lack of clear delineation in the framing and the shifting focal lengths lets characters kind of shift in and out of things. Batman can move between shadows, the Riddler can emerge from yellow neons and depart into the spaces between doorways. The literal framing and the way things are shot and the lighting combined with the camera work means that the literalization of the space is far less important than what people are doing in it. This is really interesting and makes the whole thing feel like there's danger at every corner. We see it in the opening sequences where Batman could be hiding in every single shadow, and even says himself, they think I'm in the shadows, but what they don't realize is that I am the shadows. And that epitomizes the approach of cinematography and world building in this story. Anyone could be anywhere. That's the danger of Gotham. That's the thing that makes it challenging. It is this kind of cesspool of crime and disease and moral ambiguity, and it's made possible because of the architecture and the way that the architecture bleeds into the people and the people reflect the architecture and the way that that changes our perception of events. The fact that Batman could be in any shadow also means that the Riddler could as well. It means that the Riddler's recruits that he ends up finding toward the back half of the film could be as well. There is a sense of unreality or dematerialization throughout the story, the sense that you never really have the full picture of what's going on in the background. That really works for me because it combines so well with the mystery. We don't really know what's going on for so much of it that the way the cinematography is blended together with the characters and the world building and the architecture and the set design of Chicago reflect each other beautifully, and they create a kind of nice feedback loop, a really interesting kind of percussive space to play in where each different hit from each different element of the film reflects back at each other and enhances and distorts and makes strange what's already present. This version of Gotham is in perpetual sunset or rain. drenching the film in a neo-noir haze. Smokestacks plume, steam rises from gutters and manhole covers, and flying buttresses strike a balance between cyberpunk and the 80s noir of Michael Mann. If this made you feel like you were watching Manhunter, I don't think that's an accident. Also, go and rewatch Manhunter, it's incredible. If the Batman's aesthetic pulls on the 80s noir films and blends the way that reality and thriller can exist together, the score is then a mixture of 90s rock and this kind of oppressive industrial instrumentation. Reverb and bold screeching horns punctuate many scenes, often timed to character-specific actions. Batman leaps into a frame and we get a discordant, incredibly loud crack of an instrument, or as somebody does something, a violin shivers in the background, giving us a sense of unease. The hits grow harder and less pleasant as the stakes grow higher. By the climax of the film, Batman saving Catwoman is a catastrophe of sound and violence. Something that adds to this is how often the dialogue is consequently distorted and mutated to almost match the soundtrack, or indeed the soundtrack is complementary to that distortion. Because it's a story about lies and deception and mystery, and the obscurity of voices plays a key role here. The way that Bruce changes and modulates his voice, the Riddler's mask, calls via cell phone that are never quite clear, or conversations through the contact lenses, or through the walls of Arkham, or between doorways, or obscured by different objects. Barriers and obfuscation play a key role in shaping the way it feels to move through this humming, industrial, angry city. How it feels is far more important than how it looks or how it operates. We get a sense for this city of the emotion of what it's like to experience the film. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the score and the framing and the cinematography blend together in this kind of beautiful mix of impressionistic, neon yellow drenched sunsets and rain-swept streets that give us the feeling of what it would be like to live in Gotham. It's beautifully dark and omniscient and oppressive. There is always a sense of things about to go wrong, that a spasm of violence is right around the corner, but that's part of the mystery and the beauty. That's what Bruce finds so appealing. That's why he's the Batman. And indeed, you see that with Gordon, who's unwilling to put down his gun. Every character in the city is at once repulsed and attracted to its deadly, strange beauty. If we're talking about aesthetics, I think talking about the technology of the film is probably also worth doing. I noticed that in the Batmobile in particular, there's this kind of 80s retrofuturism, like yellow noir display thing. It's like this kind of really beautiful, like muted neon display. And we get this idea that like there is a tone that the film is going for. And I think it's sometimes ruined by actual real technology, like seeing a big plasma screen TV. It kind of takes away from that sense of this being like an 80s gangster noir story. But I do really like the attention to how Baroque and personal so much of this feels. There's an industrialness to even Batman's gadgets, right? His grappling hook feels like a very physical object with weight. I think equally, he just uses straight up normal bolt cutters to cut the power in the Iceberg Lounge, and that's just like really cool. There's no cool like awesome Batman gadget that like he shoots to a pillar and things like that. It's real tools that can be used in real industrial settings, and it gives it a sense of weight and gravity that I think otherwise is sometimes lost. And certainly Nolan was going for something else, right? That's more of a fantasy kind of idea and aesthetic that he's going for. Indeed, you kind of see that blend of fantasy and sci-fi in something like Tenet. But it's really critical to me here that this film, while it has some technology like that, for example, the contact lenses, nothing feels polished. There's kind of a sense of everything being dirty or used, even the cool fantasy technology. And indeed, with the car, the Batmobile, and Bruce Wayne's belongings, everything is sort of vintage and a bit out of date and a bit out of place. Nothing is ever quite contiguous. There's no cohesive aesthetic. The cohesiveness of the aesthetic of the technology is its discordance. The lack of centralization and the lack of convergence is what makes this feel the way it feels. And that's, really hard to do and do right. And so from a set design and a world-building perspective, it gives us this sense that things in Gotham have progressed and it is modern, but they haven't left a bunch of things behind that the rest of us have. There is still a sense of things never having quite moved on. Gotham seems to perpetually live in an imagined version of the past where Falcone and Maroni are still present and large figures. There's still these gangsters that gangbust like they're old-time gangsters in the 80s. They talk that way, they dress that way, they play pool. They still have this sense of like gravity and gravitas that is lost in the modern Nolan adaptation, and perhaps most of the other Batman adaptations, if we're being honest. It is this sense that Gotham is a city out of time for all time. This Gotham lives in the parenthetical. It is the space between punctuation. And if you want to set a hard-boiled noir story with Batman doing great detective work, having a city that feels like it's strange and frozen and alien and full of danger and oppression only adds to that. It gives us the real sense that like these things have stakes. It does feel like all of these things are possible because we never quite have a sense of grounding. It makes everything fraught with danger. And also, the car is cool as shit. So I kind of want to talk about the storytelling a little bit, and maybe, I guess, just kind of Batman as the anti-hero to start with. This seems obvious, but I think it's worth litigating a little bit. There is a terseness combined with confidence in this Batman that I think is brilliant. He kind of occupies scenes in a really interesting way. You know, he has a presence, whether he's physically on screen or we know he's in the room. There is a sense, because of the way the cinematography and the way the characters react to him, that he is sort of always omnipresent in a scene that he's a part of. There's a great moment in the early sequence where he's they're looking at the body of the mayor, and one of the MEs is kind of walking around giving them the detail of the scene, and he nearly walks into Batman, and the camera stays at the same height and pans across, and you see only sort of Batman's shoulders up because he's so tall. And you suddenly have that moment of like, oh yeah, this guy's a huge presence in every room. Like, he is unignorable if he wants to be seen. And that combined with the lack of verbosity and how little he talks as Batman works really, really well. Because then you have this kind of big brooding presence that only speaks when required. It gives him this element of, I don't know, like he's in control of the information he's putting out. This probably folds in well to the rawness of his fighting, and the sort of like melee that we see in this film versus the other ones that perhaps have come before it. You know, like in Nolan's Batman Begins, there's that scene at the start where, you know, he's brawling in the mud in the prison. Contrast that with the first fight scene we see with this Batman, and there is a level of aggression here that kind of feels more like an unhinged kind of MMA fighter, whereas Bruce in those films feels a bit more like kind of a kung fu guy. This Batman feels like he's out to cause physical violence at all times. He's not really doing it to disarm people, he's doing it to hurt them. And that sense of rawness is great. What adds to this and makes it ring true is that we don't get a lot of Bruce Wayne being Bruce Wayne. He's this weird recluse, and we spend a ton of the time with him actually wearing the cowl and doing Batman stuff. It places the focus on the detective work and less on kind of the broader world of Bruce Wayne, I guess, which was a big part of the Nolan trilogy. Instead, this is a man consumed by his attempts to save Gotham. He is sort of bolted into this persona that he's created. It gives it this flavor and means Batman's brutality feels not justified, but realistic to this interpretation. There is an intoxication that Bruce Wayne has with this cowl that isn't like a sexy, you know, moral dilemma. He is the Batman, and then secondary to that, he's Bruce Wayne. He's this quiet, emotional weirdo ready to enact spasms of violence at a moment's notice. He is, in a real sense, the old gun in the new world. And that's part of what I think works really, really well here. There's little things that they do to kind of reinforce that sense. I like the fact that when he walks, you know, his boots make huge sounds and they kind of jangle like they have spurs. You know, his grapple gun on his hip kind of makes him look like a cowboy sort of thing. They lean into the sense of he is this kind of sheriff who does the things that no one else is willing to do. And I think that works really well in this context, in no small part because Robert Pattinson carries off the silentness and the aloofness really well in combination with the violence. I think one of the hardest things to do as an actor, it seems to me, is when you have to do both. You have to be aloof and terse, and then suddenly be the center of attention to be the protagonist. This Batman feels like he strikes that balance, and it's all Robert Pattinson and the director Matt Reeves channeling the balance between those two things. He'll say what needs to be said when he needs to, but he keeps it to himself. There is a level of control here that makes him more and more believable as a hyper-competent vigilante. And on the note of dialogue, I absolutely love the way that everybody talks like they're in a 70s gangster film.
Hey, watch it, fellas. You got the prince of the city there.
Like Gordon and the cops and Falcone all have this weird shared lexicon of, verbal tics and phrases that just feel like you're watching like an 80s gangster film where they're like, yeah, see, let me tell you, man, that's not how it's going to be, man. And I just love it. I give it such a nice, rich voice and unique styling, right? It's modern, but like I said before, it's trapped in the past. It's set with modern technology and all this great stuff, but things haven't moved on. And that contrast is brilliant, right? The contrast of Batman beating someone to a pulp with his bare hands and this futuristic technology is the kind of inherent paradox at the heart of this story. You have the Riddler, using modern technology and modern radicalization methods online, with his followers, but to do something that feels outdated and archaic, right? He destroys the seawalls. That's a like James Bond villain type plot, right? Like destroying the seawalls is like the equivalent of like we're going to flood the city or we're going to destroy the moon. Like it feels outlandish. But because of the contrast between that and the way these characters talk and interact with the world, it never feels out of place. Even though it does seem ridiculous and outlandish, it feels like, yeah, that's something that could happen in the 80s and in this gangster setting. It kind of feels contiguous. And there is a way that this film, I guess, escapes a lot of its key challenges by really understanding tone and allowing things breathing room and subtext. And maybe that's the biggest thing, I guess, that I want to acknowledge is the amount this film leaves up to subtext. And that's possibly why, our friend didn't enjoy it as much, is that when you talk about subtext, what you're saying is, hey, you need to engage with this text and interpret it on your own kind of time and in your own kind of way. And if you're not ready for that and you just want to have a blockbuster, this wouldn't be the film for you. This is not like a classic, this isn't a Marvel type film where you can kind of just go in and have a great time. There's a lot here. I mean, you can just watch it and get what's going on. But there's a lot here that kind of matriculates throughout and slowly moves in the background, right? There are these kind of components moving in and out of focus and in and out of frame that will slowly add to your deep emotional understanding of this film. And if you're not ready to watch a film that is more concerned with emotionality than logic and procedural scene work, right? If you're cinema sins, you're like, well, that scene didn't make sense for this reason. In some ways, this film has more DNA in common with something like Twin Peaks and Heat than it necessarily does with, say, a Nolan Batman or a Marvel film. It's far more concerned with understanding how the events shape the emotionality and the response of the characters, right? That's why at the very end, it's not about Batman saving the city. It's about Batman realizing in his own internal world, hey, like, the thing that I've been focusing on isn't getting me to the place I want to be. Like, my assumptions about the world are wrong. I need to kind of look to try and change myself rather than look to try and enact change on the world. And the way I do that is this way, right? And that's why Batman and Catwoman don't get together at the end. He has a lot more learning and growth to do, and so does she. They're not ready to be together because the film is so concerned with their emotionality and the morality and the way that they interact with what they're thinking and feeling. The way that they perceive the world is far more important than the actions they do upon it. The takeaways from the actions they do upon the world are far more important than the actions themselves. Yes, it's important Batman saved people, but he didn't save the city, it's still flooded. Yes, it's important that he saved Catwoman, but he didn't save everybody. There is still tons of damage, there's still going to be rampant crime. It's about how you process and deal with what happens while doing your best that is the key thing this film is interested in, and how that shapes people. I don't know, I guess at the risk of saying that this film is a lot more interested in something different, can be off-putting, and I think would be not great for some people who are expecting a different sort of experience or a different sort of story. But it is very deliberate in that sense, in my opinion. It is really trying to do one thing and do one thing really, really well. But yeah, I mean, that's just like, that was my initial thoughts. We might do a podcast or something, I don't know. What did you think of the Batman? I would love to know. I know some people really didn't like it, and if you didn't like it, I'd love to know why. I'm actually super interested. Coming out of it so, excited about it and engaged in it. I would really love to know if people have kind of differing opinions. I mean, what those might be, because I think it's really valid to not have enjoyed this. I think it was really specific and direct and trying to do something very, very specific. And that may just not be for you, but maybe there's something specific you didn't like, or something you would recommend changing. Equally, if you did enjoy it, I'd love to know that too. Why did you enjoy it? What did you take away from it? And maybe what do you want to see next, with these stories? Where do you want to see it go? But that's it. There was no plan to this. I just had a series of dot points. So let me know in the comments down below what you thought of the film. If you have any ideas, or if you think my ideas are stupid. Bye.